what part of the Sitecore 10 release, because I think just creation of those images and hosting them publicly, I wouldn't really consider that to be an enhancement. What part of Sitecore 10 software got enhanced in order to make this easier, in order to facilitate this?
I think they made several different changes, like for example, the license file. So the license file doesn't have to be a license file. It can now be an environment variable that gets taken by the container to check for license. So those kinds of improvements they made so that it works with containers. But I don't know of the others, but they are making some changes so that it works with containers better.
That makes sense.
Okay. Can you clarify me something? So for when you deploy these containers, you would always deploy like the blank Sitecore instance.
Right.
And are there tools to deploy your actual custom code, or can you kind of integrate this? For example, if you're creating a new environment with everything preset, can you do that? For
yes.
specific project?
Yeah.
Yes.
You create your environment, right? It's a blank Sitecore environment that gets created with all the different roles and everything. And you have your Visual Studio with your custom code, with unicorn serializations and all those things, normally the same way that you do.
Okay.
The change is when you publish it, you were publishing it into the Sitecore instance for your machine, but instead you would publish it to a folder that is mounted as a volume for the containers.
Okay.
So that mounted volume is where you are deploying your code, and that deployed one is automatically pulled by the containers process and deployed into the Sitecore instance in the container.
Right, but let's say, I think what Byron might be asking, so let's say that after you're done, you're working, you check in your code, and now you want it to go out to the QA environment. How do you get your Docker image and the changes that you've made out to the testing environment, and how do you get it so that everybody else is using whatever changes you've made?
Right. There are two ways to do that, or at least I can see two ways to do that, depending on a little bit on how their environment is set up, how you have your containers running. If let's say that you have a single machine, right? You could do the same thing that you sort of do in your local environment, where you deploy to specific folders. So you do the same thing that we do right now, where we have our Octopus release process with a Jenkins build process, and the Octopus just basically deploys a package and writes to a specific set of folders that are mounted or connected into the Docker instance. And the Docker instance, the Docker container basically pulls those items and just reads them from there like if they were locally, and you restart it via Docker commands, and you have your instance running. The other option is a bit more interesting option, where you think about your containers are not mutable. They basically do not change. So whenever you check in your codes, the build process, what actually generates is a Docker image with your release already embedded into it. And this is using the capability of Docker where you have layers. So you continue to add it to these layers, just that the top layers will be your code. And whatever steps you need to deploy that code at the specific locations that it needs, and any other services or things that you need to install or configure. And after that, when it's done, you just deploy the container to the instance that it needs to run it, and that's it.
So you would have to decide whether you are going to be using images for your developmental work, or whether you are going to be following the traditional way of development work, where you're not building images for every code change. That's one other pattern. Like, I mean, if you are looking at building images based on your source code, then you have to write your Docker file so that it builds images out of your code base.
But the cool part is that you can develop one way locally and deploy to QA in a different way, or deploy to Integ and QA and production in the same way.
So what does that look like for a developer? Let's say that we do option 2, where we want to, our release is a Docker image. And that's what gets tested, and that's what gets moved and promoted from environment to environment. First of all, how big is that Docker image? Is it even feasible to actually promote a Docker image? How many gigabytes is that we're moving around? And second, what does it look like for a developer to have to generate that Docker image? What kind of inputs do they need to do to augment the previous release Docker image so that it includes their new stuff in it?
Basically, the Docker file is the one that tells or tells the story of building. You basically will have a require where you say, hey, I want such and such Docker release or such and such Docker image. It may be the one from Sitecore, or it might be our own that we build and customize for our client, a specific client, right? And we add simply the layers that are missing there, or the elements that are missing, and we can layer it up so that, for example, if we only need to deploy, or maybe we layer it so images go in one section, and then files or other type of configuration or DLLs kind of go in a different layer. We can play around with it and see what it will be best for us. There is a lot
Well,
of
you're not being, or I'm not understanding you. Okay.
So
So you have the Docker file that's a text file, a configuration
Yes.
file that tells you what the layers are and which
Yes.
images layer on top of which images, right? But a developer is gonna, when they make a change, they're gonna be making change to C# and to views, and so there's gonna be CS HTML files and CS files that need to be compiled into new DLLs. So what happens after they check those into source control?
Yeah, so you basically don't have to, I mean, you build your Docker file such that all the published version of the whole Visual Studio solution is built into a folder, and then you copy that folder into your Docker instance, right? Docker image, where in the Docker file, you mention that, okay, copy all this output into my container, into this image. Say the base image is Sitecore image, right? And on that image, you are putting your files, you're copying all your output of the publish of all the solution, and you are copying it into that image. And then you are doing any other additional things that you want to do in that, with the commands that come with Docker file commands, right? Whatever the different commands that you can use. And then you build that image using the Docker build command.
So you're saying, I think you're saying that the CI server would still be pulling your code out. It would still be compiling it. And then your CI server would be doing the Docker compose to pull down the Docker image, add the new artifacts to the new Docker image, and then
build an
compose the new image, and then push it up to a repo.
Right.
Yes. Just take into account that is a Docker build. The Docker compose is more is another utility that it allows you to build a full environment, or it's like for a recipe, the Docker compose, where you compose.
It's an orchestrator.
Yes,
it's an orchestrator that builds different containers for you. What does the solution need? It needs a SQL Server container. It requires a Solar container, and it requires Sitecore container. So on.
And it works with
now that Docker image that Jenkins builds using Docker build, how big is that? Is that the size of a full Docker running?
It's not that, okay. So this is where the optimization comes into play, and depends a lot. Like, for example, how much Windows core or whatever OS we decide to use for whatever image has optimized to make it very small. Because the Docker instances or the Docker base images, for example, they try to be as small as possible, simply because it's intended for you to have the very minimum. And I'm
right,
sure,
but we already know based on the current Sitecore images that it's going to be the size of those current images plus what our normal project load is, which is another couple 200 to 400 megabytes.
Yes.
Right. It's roughly the Sitecore images right now are of the order of 10 gigs.
Yeah.
The Sitecore images are of the order of 10 gigs. But imagine this. If you are using Sitecore 10, let's say, right? That's a 10 gig image that you are pushing. But on top of it, probably you have your output, which is the Visual Studio Publish, which is probably, let's say, 200 MB or 300 MB or something like that, it gets added. So if you're using multiple Sitecore 10 projects, they all will be able to pull down this 10 gig Sitecore image and lay over the 300 or 400 publish of yours to build that image, right? So if it already has that base version, then it won't pull that base version. It will keep it, and it will layer on top of it the publish of that particular
Right.
project.
So that helps in the pulling down so that you can build your new image, right?
Right.
But after you build your new image and you need to then promote that image to
Even pushing
your
also.
QA and
It's the same
test.
thing.
It's the same thing on pushing also.
Yes, because when you download, for example, if you run a Docker and it has multiple layers, you will see how the different layers are sort of being updated and downloaded, right? So if you, for any reason, haven't modified any of the top layer that you already have, and you just modify the lowest, the most lowest layer, that's the only layer that you need to update. And then the Docker will take into account, rebuild the image, or not rebuild it, but put the layer on top and then run the instance from there. So basically what it will mean for our release process is that it gets simplified in the sense that Docker is the one that is pulling the images and making sure that everything is up to the date that we want. And the release and the amount of data that gets moved along is probably going to be around the same amount of data that we need to push right now.
So every release, if we do 10 releases a day, every release is going to be still 300 to 300 megabytes get pushed up to the repository.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. If we change everything and we move everything, again, that's where I'm very curious to see how we can optimize it, and also what the community comes out with and say, hey, I do this number of layers in this way, so that improves the deployment process. It makes that I have to move less bytes around, or megabytes, right, bytes around. So there is work to be done here.
Yeah, but the bigger thing, Christian, here is that Sitecore is providing some guidance documents on this and providing more push for the containers. So there is, I think, till this point, it was more the community was doing it on their own and trying to push things. But now there is a backing from Sitecore that this is how you can do with it. And these are the guidance documents using containers. And how do you construct your production environment doing containers? So they are providing those documents now. So that's of big help in the community now. It will be more a big push.
Yeah.
So are those instructions or those recommendations assuming that you're using cloud Kubernetes?
Yeah, I mean, what I saw was they were using Azure Kubernetes. So, I mean,
but they say that they will work for any Kubernetes that you put it into, as long as it's a standard Kubernetes implementation, right? What I didn't see was Docker Swarm. I only saw Docker Kubernetes.
Yeah, they were pushing for Kubernetes as the production container orchestrating environment.
Right, but in theory, Swarm could work. And the reason that I like Swarm is because it's a bit more simplistic. And then though Sitecore is a pretty interesting and complicated system, I'm still thinking that it might just work fine with Swarm instead of Kubernetes, because Kubernetes has a ton of features, and so many features that sometimes you get lost a little bit, or at least I do.